Hi guys, here we are, week 2. Can you believe it already? This week we're going to be focusing on the Vietnam War. This is one of my most favorite things to teach. I'm really bummed that we're not in the classroom so we can be talking about it. I think it's just such an interesting and chaotic time that had such really big effects. So, anyways, before we get into this guy over here on the slide, who some of you may recognize, I just want to start by saying, Vietnam had a really long and difficult history. They were colonized by the French. It was known as French Indochina, and that was in the age of imperialism. So, like the late 1800s is when that happened. And then France held on to Vietnam all the way until World War II. And when World War II started, the French were defeated and left. And that left the Vietnamese occupied by the Japanese. Well, then you guys know, the Japanese lose World War II. And in that process, they also lose the areas they had conquered. So Vietnam is going to be in some turmoil. Well, the French decide we want it back. That was our colony and we want it back. While the Vietnamese at this point were kind of in the situation where they were like, you know what, we should get our independence. So there began to be some problems, and the French and the Vietnamese fought for a few years. During this time, the United States kind of watched and whatnot, and started to send over military advisors quite early. And these weren't soldiers, but they were people who could like help train and bring supplies and weapons and that kind of stuff. So no soldiers right away, but this is happening right after World War II, you guys. Anyways, things are going to build up in the 50s. Of course, the United States is going to be fighting the Korean War. They're going to be dealing with the Soviet Union and the ideas of containment. And in the 1960s, things in Vietnam are going to escalate. And they are going to escalate under this man's tenure. And again, this is Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Lyndon Baines Johnson, he comes to the presidency in 1963 when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Um, Johnson's a really interesting guy. He was a longtime senator from Texas. He was a Senate Majority Leader. I got a bunch of words right here. I'll kind of talk you through it. John F. Kennedy, some of you know, he was from Boston, Massachusetts. And so they chose Lyndon Baines Johnson to try to win over some of the Southern Democrats and some of kind of the more common man. Lyndon Baines Johnson was definitely that type. He didn't come from a rich family like the Kennedys did. Anyway, so John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I have the link there if you want to see. It's kind of all these different footages put together. It's pretty dramatic. You will see Kennedy's head get blown off. And yeah, it's pretty awful. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, they were in Dallas, Texas, and Johnson was kind of nervous about all of that because the precedent had been set that the vice president would take over, but it wasn't constitutional law yet. And John F. Kennedy had a very powerful brother by the name of Bobby Kennedy, and we'll talk about him a little later. I find him a very interesting guy as well. But Bobby Kennedy had been appointed by John as the Attorney General, so he was the head lawyer in the country. And Johnson was kind of nervous. The Kennedys were very powerful, and he was nervous that Bobby would try to take the presidency and that the Americans would let him take it because John F. Kennedy was really beloved by the Americans. So on the flight back to Washington on Air Force One, Johnson gets Jackie O, who was JFK's wife, to stand there as he's being sworn in on the plane. And she was still wearing the pink dress. If you watch the video, you'll see it. The pink dress that had been splattered in JFK's blood. So, anyways, the Vietnam War is, starting to escalate under JFK, but definitely it's going to really intensify starting in 1964. So this is one of the big effects of this is that Johnson is going to choose to not seek re-election in 1968, probably one of the most deadliest years of, I don't know, of our modern time. 68 was a crazy year. We're going to come back to this last little thing on here, the New Deal type program. As you can see in the first paragraph, Johnson was inspired by Franklin Roosevelt. He had served in Congress at that time. Then he became senator later. But And so he does create this program called the Great Society. So we'll look at that in a few weeks. But one of the big problems was there's only so much money to spend. So he found himself spending more money on the Vietnam War than he would have liked, and he had less money to spend on programs like the Great Society, which was a program to combat poverty and try to deal with poverty and poor nutrition and all kinds of things, poor healthcare and things like that. So again, more on that later. Okay, so like I said, in 1964, things are going to escalate, and this is because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin on this map is right up here, so you can see where it's located in the far north. And after this resolution, I'm going to have you guys, you can watch a little video, which I highly recommend, about the Vietnam War. And it covers the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or Gulf of Tonkin crisis. But after this, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allows Lyndon Baines Johnson to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, in this case by the Communist government of North Vietnam. So what is going to happen is that the war is going to continuously escalate year after year after year until in 1973, the War Powers Act was passed by Congress. They realized they had to rope president back in, and you can see here on that slide what that entails. But he had a lot of powers under that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. All right, now the draft, this is one reason why this is such a controversial war for many Americans. Now, I did put this picture. I wasn't sure if I was going to, but I usually do share this picture, and I do love this picture. This picture is my parents, and I think I maybe had mentioned that my parents were going to celebrate their 50th anniversary this year, so that's been, extra sad. They were married in 1970, in July. And why did I put that picture of them at their wedding? Why did I put that there? Well, because my parents were highly affected by the draft. So in this text right here, you can see there was this college deferment law that exempted college students from the draft. But things started to change as the war escalates. They, pretty soon they could defer, but then they had to go at the end of the year, and then they could defer, but they had to go at the end of the semester, and whatnot. And so then they started to institute the draft. I do want to point out that poor Americans and many minorities were highly affected by this war, and that is because they were in fewer numbers in college, and they also were disproportionately drafted. Just because that would be because of luck. So we're going to talk about that draft here in a second. But they call the Vietnam War rich man's war and a poor man's fight, and that's a lyric in a song, Unfortunate Son. But this isn't the only time this has happened in the Civil War. The rich men could pay, usually I think it was about $300, which at that time is a lot of money, to have someone substitute for them so they didn't have to go fight. So this isn't the first time we see this economic disparity in war. Okay, so I have two links on here. One is from the Vietnam in HD. So again, I'm going to give that for you guys to watch as an optional assignment, but this one here is pretty close or pretty short. So if you don't feel like watching more of it, click on that and just at least watch that. And then the news broadcast of the lottery. So that's where I get back to my parents. So in 1970 or 1969, my dad was done with college. He had deferred as long as he could. And I'm sorry, in 1968. And he had deferred as long as he could. And then he couldn't defer anymore. So he kind of figured out a backup plan, and he tried to join the Air Force. He actually has a pilot's license today, but he couldn't get in because his eyesight wasn't 20/20, so they didn't take him. He tried for the Navy. There was something going on with that. I can't remember. So he was going to be drafted, and if you were drafted, you had no choice as to where you go or where you fight. And I usually tell my students, just make fun of my dad a little, but he was raised by two South Dakota ranchers. He grew up in Southern California, but he knew how to hunt, he knew how to do all that stuff. But man, I went on a few camping trips with my dad, and I don't think he would have survived this war. So, how did he get out of the war? How did he get out? He was drafted. I'm going to show you on the next page how they chose the draft numbers. But he was drafted fourth, his birthday. That's how they did it. And he was slated to go when he was hit by a drunk driver who T-boned his car. The drunk driver ran through a red light and T-boned him. And my dad broke his femur, which is the big, your upper thigh bone. And he was in the hospital for over a month. He was in a coma, medically induced a coma, and it was a really, really bad wreck. So that ended his ability to go into the war. They weren't going to take him after that. He still has a steel rod in his leg and whatnot. So after that, he did go back to grad school and and whatnot. But my parents, they were married in the summer of 1970. And I just put that picture of them there because I think it humanizes a little bit of what this was like. You know, when my mom would tell me when the draft was happening, this news broadcast that you could watch right here, she was down at his parents' house. He was down there um, back at home, and she was from Southern California too. And, you know, she was sitting on the couch and they were just so nervous that he would be drafted. And sure enough, he was. So how did that work? Well, this chart, it's a little hard to tell, a little blurry. But here's what you do is you find your birthday, you find your month. So for example, my month is September, and then I go down to 29 and I am number 151. So that means that every single person in that year that was born on September 29th in was draft number 151. So they started with number 1 and they sent all those guys. Every American boy. Okay? And then they did, and I want to say citizens and non-citizens as well. My husband's dad was not a citizen at the time. He was over here from Sweden, and you know, he was like, if I get drafted, I'm going back to Sweden. Like, I'm not going to go fight this war. But that's just an interesting point too. So if you were an American, probably paying taxes or they had your driver's license, you were eligible. Okay, so they started with number 1. I don't recall what number 1 was, and it is a little blurry, but going back here to my dad, he was February 14th. So you can see he was the 4th birthday chosen. I think the first one, and kids either, I think it was somewhere in September, but I might be wrong. Nope, I'm wrong. Oh yeah, September 14th. So every boy born on September 14th um, in the year, so I believe it was age 18 to 25, every boy born on that birthday was taken. So look at the chart. I know it's kind of blurry, but it's the best one I could find. Look at the chart, find your birthday. If you were numbered lower than 195, you would have been sent to Vietnam. So not every guy had to go, but every guy was drafted. All right. So a couple other things about Vietnam is this bombings in Cambodia. Cambodia created quite the debacle here. On this map here, I want you to check out the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was the trail the North Vietnamese used to get supplies to their forces in the south. And you can see over here, it goes through Laos and Cambodia, a little bit in Cambodia. And over the course of the war, the United States dropped, as you can see, 2.4 million tons of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, trying to stop the delivery of these goods, weapons, food, medical supplies, etc. This is more than twice the amount of bombs dropped on Germany in World War II. So let me tell you, that is a lot. And then this is very controversial because we were not at war with Laos. We were not at war with Cambodia, but yet we were bombing their country. One of the biggest ramifications of that was the Kent State Massacre. You guys may have seen this photograph before. You can see this is a college student. Kent State is a college campus in Ohio. And after the bombings in Cambodia, and then President Nixon is going to be in charge at the time. He's going to announce a planned U.S. invasion of Cambodia. That college kids started to protest in huge numbers. And you see that here. And the National Guard was called in, sorry, the Ohio National Guard, and this college student was shot. All right. Okay, so we're going to stop there. The next part has to do with more protests. It's pretty short. Thanks, guys.